Somewhere in your kitchen right now, something is dying. Not dramatically, quietly. A wilting bundle of scallions in the crisper drawer. A jar of garlic paste growing a thin gray film on top. Half a bottle of soy sauce losing its punch because it's been sitting open since spring. A handful of dried mushrooms slowly absorbing moisture in a cupboard, edging closer to mold. Every single day, you don't notice them. None of this is your fault. Nobody ever taught you how long food is actually supposed to last, or what to do to make it last longer. Most of us were only ever handed one rule: when in doubt, put it in the fridge, and left to figure out the rest through trial, error, and the occasional science experiment growing in the back of a shelf. But in Chinese households, this exact problem was solved generations ago, not with vacuum sealers or expensive gadgets, but with salt, oil, sun, and a stubborn refusal to let anything go to waste. Today, I'm giving you 31 of those tricks. Some will save you money, some will completely change how an ingredient tastes, and at least one of them, the century egg trick near the end, is going to make you feel a little betrayed that nobody told you sooner, because it sounds impossible until you understand why it actually works. Stick around for all 31, because the ones near the middle and the end are the ones almost nobody outside a Chinese kitchen has ever heard of. Hi, welcome back to Wei Liang. This channel exists for one reason: to dig up the quiet, practical genius hidden inside everyday Asian kitchens. The habits nobody writes cookbooks about, but that get passed down anyway, from a grandmother's hands to a mother's hands to, apparently, a YouTube video you're watching right now. And honestly, I respect that. These aren't hacks someone invented for clicks. Most of them are older than refrigeration itself. Before we get into it, if this is your first time here, hit subscribe now, because these 31 tricks are just the surface. This channel is full of them, and we go deeper every single week. We are going to move through this in 4 parts: fresh produce and herbs, proteins and sauces, fermenting and pickling, and finally the pantry, oil, and dry preservation tricks that most people have never even heard of. Let's start where every kitchen problem starts: the vegetable drawer. Trick 1. Wrap leafy greens in a dry paper towel before bagging them. Bok choy, napa cabbage, and Chinese broccoli wilt fast because trapped moisture in a plastic bag turns into condensation, and condensation is what actually rots the leaves, not age. Chinese households wrap greens loosely in a paper towel first, then bag them. The towel absorbs the moisture instead of the leaves. Greens that would normally last 3 days can hold for over a week, and the difference is visible the moment you open the bag, crisp and dry instead of slimy at the edges. It's such a small change that most people dismiss it the first time they hear it, right up until they actually try it, and realize the greens they usually throw out are the ones they simply stored wrong. Trick 2. Store ginger in sand or dry rice, not the fridge. This is an old country trick that still works better than anything modern. Bury a knob of ginger in a container of dry rice or sand, and it stays firm and fresh for months, because the rice pulls away excess moisture while shielding the ginger from air. No sprouting, no soft spots, and the rice itself doesn't go to waste either. It can still be cooked afterward. It's a technique that feels almost too simple to actually work, but it mirrors exactly how root vegetables have been stored in cellars for centuries, buried in something dry that pulls moisture away without letting the air in. Trick 3. Keep garlic bulbs whole and unpeeled in a clay or paper container, never plastic. Garlic breathes. Sealing it in plastic traps humidity and speeds up sprouting and mold. A breathable container in a cool, dark spot can keep whole garlic bulbs good for months, sometimes closer to half a year, which matters if you buy garlic in bulk, the way most Chinese households do. The moment you peel or crush garlic, the clock speeds up dramatically, which is exactly why it's kept whole and untouched until the second it's actually needed. Trick 4. Preserve scallions by rooting them in water on the windowsill. Instead of storing scallions to slowly die in the fridge, stand the root ends in a small glass of water in indirect light. They don't just survive, they regrow. Snip what you need, and they keep producing for weeks, sometimes months, on nothing but water and light. This isn't preservation technically, it's cheating the system entirely, and once you start doing it, buying scallions again feels almost unnecessary. Trick 5. Salt cure Napa cabbage, the way it's done before making kimchi or pao sai. Layer sliced cabbage with salt, let it sit for a few hours, and the salt draws out water, which suppresses the bacteria that cause rot, while feeding the ones that ferment safely. Salted cabbage lasts weeks in the fridge, and it's the entry point for half the pickle recipes in Chinese and Korean cooking alike. A single afternoon of prep buying you a month of ready condiments. It also solves a problem almost every household has, buying one whole Napa cabbage and only using a quarter of it before the rest turns watery and sad in the crisper drawer. Trick 6. Dry chili peppers in a well-ventilated spot instead of the fridge. Fresh chilies mold quickly, especially in humid climates. Strung on thread and hung in a dry, airy place, they dehydrate naturally and keep for a year or more, and dried chilies actually deliver a deeper, smokier heat than fresh ones ever could, which is exactly why so many classic sauces call for the dried version specifically. A bag of chilies bought cheap in season and dried at home can outlast an entire year of cooking at a fraction of what the dried version costs at the store. Trick 7. Store fresh herbs stemmed down in water, loosely covered with a bag, like a bouquet. Cilantro and Chinese chives die fast because they lose water through the cut stem the same way a cut flower would. Treat them like flowers, trim the stems, stand them in a jar of water, and loosely tent a bag over the top. What normally wilts in 2 days can stay crisp for over a week, sitting right there on the counter instead of hidden and forgotten in the crisper. Trick 8. Sun-dry excess mushrooms instead of letting them slime over. Fresh shiitake and wood ear mushrooms spoil within days no matter how carefully you store them. Laid out in direct sun for 1 to 2 days, they dry completely, and dried mushrooms don't just last for a year. Rehydrated, they release a savory depth that fresh mushrooms simply don't have. Nothing goes to waste, and the flavor actually improves, which is the theme you're going to notice again and again throughout this list. A single sunny weekend can turn a pound of mushrooms that would have spoiled by Wednesday into a pantry ingredient that outlasts the season entirely. That's the produce and herb section. Every single one of those tricks costs you nothing but a few minutes and maybe a paper towel. Now let's talk about the ingredients people actually worry about wasting: meat, fish, and the sauces that hold a Chinese kitchen together. Trick 9. Marinate meat before it ever touches the freezer. Instead of freezing raw meat plain, Chinese households portion it directly into a marinade of soy sauce, Shaoxing wine, and cornstarch before freezing. The meat marinates as it freezes and as it thaws, so by the time it hits the wok, it has already absorbed hours of flavor, and you've eliminated an entire prep step from your future self's evening. This is the difference between coming home exhausted and still eating something that tastes deliberate versus throwing plain thawed meat into a pan and hoping the sauce makes up for it. Trick 10. Cure fish with salt for a few hours before storing. A light dry salt cure draws moisture out of fish, which slows bacterial growth dramatically. Salted fish keeps far longer in the fridge than untreated fish, and it's the foundation of dishes like preserved salted fish that Chinese coastal households have relied on for centuries, long before ice was something you could count on having. Fishermen's families, in particular, built entire pantries around this single technique, turning a catch that would otherwise spoil within a day into something that could feed a household for weeks. Trick 11. Air-dry cured sausage, lapchong, instead of refrigerating it. Chinese sausage is deliberately made with a higher fat and sugar ratio and air-dried until firm. Properly dried, it can hang at room temperature in a cool, dry spot for months without spoiling, which is exactly why it shows up in Lunar New Year cooking every single year without fail, made months in advance and simply waiting. Trick 12. Render and store schmaltz-style pork or chicken fat in a sealed jar. Excess fat trimmed from meat gets rendered down and stored in the fridge, where it solidifies and keeps for months. It becomes a cooking fat with more flavor than plain oil, and it's essentially free since it comes from meat you already bought and would otherwise have trimmed straight into the bin. A spoonful used in place of oil adds a savory depth to fried rice or vegetables that plain oil simply cannot deliver, no matter how good the oil is. Trick 13. Preserve eggs the traditional way with a salt and clay coating. Salted duck eggs are coated in a paste of salt, clay, and sometimes ash, then left to cure for weeks. The salt slowly penetrates the shell, firming the white and turning the yolk a deep orange, oily, and intensely savory. It's a preservation method that actually creates a completely different ingredient, one prized specifically for what the curing process does to it, not despite it. The finished egg, sliced in half over congee or steamed with minced pork, has become its own dish entirely, separate from the plain egg it started as. Trick 14. Freeze soy sauce, oyster sauce, and other condiments in ice cube trays once opened. Opened bottles slowly oxidize and lose potency over months sitting in the fridge door. Portioning them into cubes locks in the flavor at its peak, so a cube dropped into a hot wok tastes like it came straight from a fresh bottle, even a year after you opened it. Trick 15. Store dried shrimp and dried scallops in an airtight jar with a moisture packet. These ingredients are prized specifically because drying concentrates their umami into something almost impossibly potent. Kept airtight and dry, they last well over a year, and a small handful rehydrated in warm water can carry the entire flavor base of a soup that would otherwise need hours of simmering to build. It's the same principle behind anchovy paste or dried shiitake. A tiny amount of something intensely concentrated, doing the work of a much larger quantity of fresh ingredients. Trick 16. Preserve bone broth as frozen flat sheets, not blocks. Stock frozen in a flat, thin layer inside a bag thaws in minutes instead of hours because you're not fighting a solid brick of ice, you're snapping off exactly the portion you need for tonight's soup and leaving the rest untouched. It also means a single big pot of stock, made once, can quietly restock your freezer for months instead of disappearing in one sitting. That's proteins and sauces handled. Quick pause here. If you're finding even one or two of these useful, Drop a comment telling me which trick surprised you most. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who'd want to see it, and I read every single one. Now let's get into the part of Chinese food preservation that Western kitchens almost never talk about: deliberate fermentation and pickling, done on purpose, not by accident. Trick 17. Make pao cai, Sichuan pickled vegetables, in a sealed brine jar. Vegetables submerged in a saltwater brine with chilies and Sichuan peppercorns ferment naturally over days, developing a tangy, effervescent crunch that store-bought pickles rarely match. Properly maintained, the brine jar can be topped up and reused indefinitely, essentially becoming a self-renewing preservation system that some households keep running for years, even decades, passed down the way a sourdough starter would be in a Western kitchen. Trick 18. Preserve mustard greens as suan kai, sour pickled greens. Mustard greens, salted and left to ferment in their own liquid, turn tangy and intensely savory, and they keep in that brine for months in a cool spot. Used a handful at a time in soups and braises, adding depth without needing any extra seasoning. It's the kind of ingredient that quietly makes a plain broth taste like it's been building flavor for hours, when really, it's just been sitting in a jar, doing the work on its own. Trick 19. Ferment black beans into dushi. Soybeans fermented with salt and mold cultures over weeks become intensely pungent, salty, umami bombs that, once dried, keep almost indefinitely at room temperature and only need a small spoonful to transform a stir-fry from ordinary into something that tastes like it took all day. A jar the size of your fist can genuinely last most households the better part of a year, since a little bit goes such a long way. Trick 20. Make your own doubanjiang, fermented broad bean and chili paste, in bulk. This Sichuan staple ferments over months in a sealed crock, and the resulting paste keeps for a year or more once refrigerated, growing more complex the longer it sits, which is the opposite of almost every other condiment you own, most of which only get worse with time. Trick 21. Pickle garlic in vinegar and sugar for long-term storage. Whole garlic cloves, submerged in a vinegar-sugar brine, turn mellow and slightly sweet over weeks, losing their raw bite entirely, and the acidity means they keep safely in the fridge for the better part of a year, ready to eat straight from the jar or chopped into a sauce. It's one of the easiest tricks on this entire list to start with tonight, since it needs nothing more exotic than vinegar, sugar, and a jar you probably already have in a cupboard. Trick 22. Preserve mustard tuber as zha cai. The knobby stem of the mustard plant, salted, pressed, and coated in chili paste, becomes one of the longest-lasting condiments in Chinese cooking. A jar can realistically sit in the fridge for months and only get better with age, growing more fragrant and complex the longer it's left alone. Trick 23. Make century-preserved eggs using an alkaline lime and ash coating. This is the most extreme preservation method on this list. Eggs coated in an alkaline paste of lime, ash, and salt cure for weeks to months, and the alkalinity breaks down proteins so completely that the egg turns translucent, jelly-like, and can then be stored at room temperature for a remarkably long time without ever touching a fridge, a genuinely ancient technology that still works exactly as intended today. It looks strange the first time you see it, but once you understand it as chemistry rather than decay, it stops being strange and starts being kind of brilliant. That's fermentation and pickling, the section that turns simple vegetables and beans into ingredients that last for months, sometimes years, and get better with age instead of worse. Last section, the pantry, oil, and dry preservation tricks that tie everything together. Trick 24. Store rice in a sealed container with a bay leaf or dried chili. A bay leaf or whole dried chili tucked into a rice container repels the pantry moths and weevils that ruin bulk rice, extending safe storage by months without any chemical treatment, just one dried ingredient, doing quiet, constant work. It's a habit worth adopting even if you don't buy rice in bulk, since the same trick works just as well protecting flour, dried beans, and other pantry staples that pests love just as much. Trick 25. Dry roast and jar Sichuan peppercorns, whole rather than pre-ground. Ground spices lose their aromatic oils within weeks, sometimes days once exposed to air. Kept whole and dry roasted only right before use, Sichuan peppercorns hold their numbing, citrusy punch for well over a year, tasting almost identical to the day they were bought. Trick 26. Preserve chili oil with a layer of oil sealing the surface. Chili flakes infused in hot oil, then kept with a clean oil layer, sealing out air, resist rancidity far longer than exposed chili flakes would, keeping the flavor sharp for months at room temperature or in the fridge, instead of turning stale and bitter within weeks. The oil layer works almost like a lid within the lid, and topping it up every time you use a spoonful keeps the whole jar protected for as long as you keep making it. Trick 27. Store dried tangerine peel, chenpi, for years, not months. It's meant to age. Chenpi is aged mandarin peel, dried and stored in a breathable container, and unlike almost anything else in this list, it's deliberately kept for years, sometimes decades, because the flavor deepens and mellows the older it gets. This is preservation as a form of patience, an ingredient designed to reward waiting rather than punish it. Some households keep a jar going for decades, adding fresh peel every year and pulling from the oldest layer at the bottom, which is exactly backwards from how we treat almost everything else in a kitchen. Trick 28. Preserve tofu skin and dried bean curd sticks in an airtight bag away from light. Dried in sheets or sticks, tofu skin keeps for the better part of a year in a cool, dark cupboard, rehydrating in minutes to form the base of soups, braises, and vegetarian mock meat dishes that taste far richer than the dried, brittle sticks would suggest. It's one of those pantry staples that looks unremarkable, sitting on a shelf, right up until it goes into a pot and quietly becomes the most satisfying part of the dish. Trick 29. Cure and dry pork belly into larue, Chinese bacon, using salt and air. Salted, seasoned, and hung to air dry, pork belly transforms into a dense, intensely savory cured meat that keeps for months without refrigeration, sliced thin as needed for stir-fries and rice dishes, a little going a long way in terms of flavor. What starts as a fairly ordinary cut of pork belly becomes something with a completely different character once it's had time to cure, dense and savory rather than soft and mild. Trick 30. Store 5 spice, star anise, and cassia bark whole in a dark, airtight jar. Whole spices kept away from light and heat retain their essential oils far longer than ground versions, some staying potent for 2 years or more, which matters enormously in a cuisine built around slow braises that depend entirely on those exact aromatics staying strong. A braise simmered for hours only tastes as good as the spices that went into it at the start, and stale, faded spices are one of the most common, least noticed reasons a home-cooked dish falls short of a restaurant version. Trick 31. Preserve plums, dates, and hawthorn as dried, sugared snacks. Fruit sliced and dried in the sun, sometimes with a light sugar coating, becomes a shelf-stable snack that keeps for months at room temperature, turning a perishable fruit into something you can reach for any time of year, long after the fresh season has ended. So there they are, 31 preservation tricks that Chinese households have leaned on for generations, long before refrigeration was ever a guarantee. Salt, sun, fermentation, and air did the work that a freezer does for most of us today, and honestly, a lot of them still do it better, producing flavors a freezer simply can't replicate. None of these require special equipment, a big budget, or years of practice, just a willingness to look at an ingredient and ask what it actually needs instead of defaulting to the fridge out of habit. If you only remember 5 of these, make it the ginger in rice, the flat frozen soy sauce cubes, the pao cai brine jar, the chenpi you deliberately forget about for a few years, and the chili oil sealed under its own oil layer. Try even a couple of these, and I promise, your kitchen starts to feel less like a place where food quietly disappears, and more like one where nothing goes to waste, and everything is exactly where you left it, in better condition than when it went in. That shift, from managing decay to actively improving your ingredients over time, is really the whole philosophy behind this list. If this kind of thing is useful to you, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. We're going deeper into Chinese kitchen habits every single week, and there's a lot more where this came from. This is Wei Liang. If you want to see exactly how Chinese households use the freezer specifically to stretch every last ingredient, that video is right here. I'll see you there.